Very little is known about the soldiers pictured, except that they are Confederates.
I cannot tell you who those people are, and nobody can. Part of that is a lot of people died at the Battle of Gettysburg, especially the people who were to write these reports. I would say it's most likely some Georgians under a guy named General Sims who died, or some South Carolinians under Joseph B. Kershaw.
When you study history, there's black holes everywhere. Some people have a misconception that because there are thousands of books about Gettysburg and because we know so much about the battle, that we know virtually everything there is to know, and it's not like that at all. And you also find that some of the more famous fights, like Pickett's Charge, receive a lot of attention, but a site like this, because there are holes in the amount of information that we have, historians just don't focus on this, and they focus on the famous things for which we have a lot of information. And the fact that we have so little information about this fight makes it even more a compelling subject to try and solve these mysteries.
From the moment Frassanito identified the Rose Farm as the location of 12 famous images, he knew he wanted to write a book about battlefield photography at Gettysburg. In 1968, he graduated Gettysburg College, and in 1969, he wrote his master's thesis, Photography at Gettysburg, 1863 to 1866, while at the State University of New York at Oneonta. A 2-year stint in the Army as an artillery officer and later as an intelligence analyst followed. Soon, Frassanito was back home on Long Island, New York, working on the manuscript for his book. Gettysburg, A Journey in Time, was published in 1975 to great critical acclaim.
We got a lot of press on it. When Journey came out, it made big waves. And interesting for me is that this is 24 years ago, and a lot of my findings have now been incorporated into the general story of the battle.
More than 1 million people visit Gettysburg every year. Many use Journey in Time as a guide. One of their favorite destinations is a place called Devil's Den, where, Frassanito tells us, the photographers manipulated the scene to create their own sense of drama. In 1866, photographer Alexander Gardner published his Compendium of Civil War Photographs, Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war. In it was this dramatic image, labeled Home of a Rebel Sharpshooter, Gettysburg. An accompanying text described this perfectly intact body as that of a Confederate sharpshooter who had been wounded by a shell fragment and had stretched out upon his blanket to await death. Curiously, several views also taken by photographers Alexander Gardner, James Gibson, and Timothy O'Sullivan seem to show the same body in a different location. Did the photographers move the corpse to create a better composition? And if so, which photo was taken first? William Frassanito decided to investigate further. Where were the two locations? How far would the photographers have had to tote the body? And what do the two spots look like today? Frassanito devoted years to answering these puzzling questions. In the end, he came to some startling conclusions. The dead soldier was indeed the same man depicted in both locations. What's more, there was clear evidence of manipulation by the photographers. The site of the sharpshooter's home is a well-known tourist attraction at Gettysburg. However, the location of the other photographs was obscured by brush and much more difficult for Frassanito to find. He estimated the distance between the two sites as roughly 40 yards. However, after the brush was cleared, Frassanito revisited the site and correctly measured the distance between the two spots as 72 yards, much of it uphill over rocky terrain. How did the photographers pull off their deception? And could this scenario be recreated? Wet plate photographer Rob Gibson, guided by Frassanito's research and aided by some local historians, set about to reconstruct the movement of the body.
Well, when I first got Journey in Time, I was not only fascinated by it, but inspired by it. How much research was done to actually document the work that these photographers did. And this was something that really saw the importance of what their work was. Bill has been not only an inspiration to me, but he's been a great help for me, and I feel honored that there's times where he'll call me or I can call him, and we can ask each other questions. He is a very special man, and I've never seen such a researcher that goes to such lengths to find out exactly what happened.
Through careful research and logical deduction, Frassanito surmised that the views taken in this area, known as Devil's Den, to be some of the last death studies made at Gettysburg by Alexander Gardner and his crew. They were in a race against time.
Of all the photographers who covered the Gettysburg battlefield, Gardner was the only one who had time constraints because he had to get these photographs taken before the dead were buried.
After the Battle of Gettysburg, the Northern Army had held the field. The Northern Army had burial crews. The Northern burial crews buried all the Northern soldiers first. And then they went back and buried the Confederate bodies. They buried the Confederate bodies where they could easily be buried. Since areas such as Devil's Den were covered with rocks, it was not easy to bury the bodies, and they saved those bodies till last. So last bodies on the battlefield to be buried were Southern dead on the southern end of the battlefield.
Frassanito believes that Gardner and his team proceeded to Devil's Den after completing their work at the Rose Farm.
We cannot exactly trace their path, but I would say most likely they probably scouted the place out in the early evening hours of perhaps July 6th, when they were done at the Rose Farm. And then the next day probably took their wagon up to what we call the Wheatfield Road, and then down through what we call the Valley of Death and into Devil's Den somewhere.
In those days, travel for photographers was by means of a horse-drawn wagon.
From a photographer's standpoint, working with a wet plate process, every time they moved that wagon, they had to reset the chemicals, repour the baths. So it was unhook the horses, let them out to graze. You never see a photograph of a Civil War photographer's wagon with a horse hook to it, because the time it took to sensitize and develop those plates. It was just too much to ask for to have that horse stand still the whole time, not jostle around. So they usually always had some sort of teamster with them also.
In addition to a teamster, Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, and James Gibson might have also had an assistant. Many of the teamsters and photographers' assistants were black. They most likely conducted the more mundane tasks like prepping the glass plates and carrying water.
What I'm doing here now is simply preparing the plate. My assistant Raymond has already cleaned these plates using what we call glass wax. During the 1860s, they used something called rotten stone, which was very similar. It was a mild pumice solution.
Now, more than likely, this was something that was done back in the studio by an apprentice who would prepare all these plates for the photographers and put them in a dust-proof box. From here, the plate is taken, wiped out again with a leather chamois, which will take off any finger marks. And while I'm doing this, I inspect the plate for any nicks or scratches. After that's done, the plate is dusted. Now, today we don't have to worry about a lot of dust because of the rain that happened the night before. A lot of the work after the battlefield, there was always a great amount of dust. You had a lot of horses, a lot of troops marching, and everything else. And those little flakes of dust will show up on the end product. So it was always a constant problem.
Once the glass plates were prepped, it was time for the photographer to make the film on which the image would be affixed. The film was composed of a liquid called collodion.
This is collodion. It's a mixture of nitrocellulose with ether and has iodides and bromides added to it. We have to mix this beforehand. This is called flowing a plate. They had to do this for every plate in the field. The plate is drying now. There's a pretty strong ether smell to it. Ether is added to the collodion to thin it out so that the plate can be flowed in such a fashion as this. And I could pour this pretty slowly today. If it were 90 degrees out, that plate would be almost dried by now, or at least very tacky, where I'd have to put it into the silver bath. It's now setting up a skin on there. Once that's dry enough, it'll be going into the silver bath. I'm letting it dry a little bit more again because of the cool conditions today. Also, you can see there's a little flaw right there which was a little hunk of hardened collodion that got knocked onto the plate as I was pouring it. That will end up in the finished product, as you'll see with a lot of Civil War photographs, all kinds of little things in there. You'll also see it's getting foggy. That's the plate cooling. So we're just waiting for the right time to put this in the silver, and we're just about there. Now it's going into the bath of silver nitrate. There's a dipper right here. Plate sits on that dipper, and down in it goes, and cover is put on the top of the silver bath. Now when I pull that plate out, what I'll be doing under darkroom light, pulling that plate out, wiping off the back of it, blotting the excess silver off it, putting it into my plate holder, chemical side out.
All the steps involved in setting up the darkroom wagon and prepping the plates required the skills of several individuals.
It's a team effort. It's not so much one person took this picture. It's one guy sensitized, developed these plates, and the other guy took and worked the camera.
One of the reasons why they worked in pairs or in teams like that was, number one, it's much easier to work under that camera all day long, composing shots, getting used to that light and exposure times, and have somebody else do the job in the darkroom. Every once in a while they would switch, and probably one of the biggest reasons for that is the collodion, the ether smell that whoever was working in the darkroom was inhaling constantly that day. There are stories of one of the photographers supposedly passed out underneath his wagon because he just took in too much of that ether smell. So by changing off like that, it would give that person a break.
In Devil's Den, 4 photographs were taken in the first location down the hill, 2 credited to Alexander Gardner and 2 to Timothy O'Sullivan. Upon close examination, these 4 images reveal a certain amount of manipulation of the scene.
Well, there's no doubt the photographers, Alexander Gardner, James Gibson, and Timothy O'Sullivan, did a lot in order to create the most poignant scene that they could. These same items appear in photograph after photograph, so we know that they did a lot of placement in this respect. I've never had a good feeling on how random it really was, but I think it was very much an art for these guys, and they simply placed them as they saw fit.
A blanket, a gun, a kepi, and a tin cup appear in different places in the various images. The Confederate soldier's body was also photographed from 3 separate tripod locations with 2 different cameras.
They were doing 810s with a large plate camera, and one of the things that we noticed in the stereo shots, they're shot awful low. One of the reasons being, to get that dramatic stereo effect, you need some sort of a foreground, your subject preferably in the forward middle ground, and your background, of course. The more contrast, the more defined depth of field, the more dramatic stereo effect that you're going to get. So that's why they're shooting from that low angle. As for the 810s, they usually reserved that for something that was very dramatic, all done for commercial venture. I mean, they were documenting, but they were also selling all these, especially the stereo views. It's estimated that 85% of all Civil War battlefield scenes were photographed in stereo. So most of what we're looking at in history books is usually just 1/2 of a stereo view.
After capturing 4 views in the downhill site, the photographers appear to have moved the dead Confederate uphill. It has recently been suggested that the sequence may have been reversed.
Yes, there was a little speculation by another researcher that this was originally the original shot, and from here the body was moved down to the rocks beyond, and I've talked in length with Bill Frassanito about that. His view as a historian, my view as a wet plate photographer. Speaking for Bill, I know that he thinks that his first speculation of the body being seen down there, photographed down there, and then moved up to this spot is what he still believes to hold true. As for myself, as a photographer, why would you have perfect setting with a perfect body, this perfect story that you want to tell, and then move it down to a nondescript spot and take and arrange the body so it's nowhere near as dramatic as what you had up here to begin with? I really can't see that happening. So I think that really Mr. Frassanito's hit the nail on the head with this.
The photographers were likely aided in their endeavor by a local civilian, or perhaps a member of a burial crew. Once repositioned, the dead Confederate soldier was posed again, the same gun now propped prominently in the center of the frame. 2 views were captured in the uphill location, the blanket appearing in one image and disappearing in another. Both of the photos were shot